shut you. That's it. Shame you and shut you, the S&S procedure, rather than having intellectual debate about a complex topic. By the way, they just tried that on the Prime Minister of Hungary. I don't know if you noticed that. And he said, that's ridiculous. He said, this is a very complex issue. You just can't deal with it by calling me a xenophobe. So, see, he understands too. Why are we going through everything that we're going through? Let's go back to Alger Hiss. Oh, by the way, before I do that, the whole purpose of keeping the debate contained and to shut you up with cliche, you're a racist, you're a xenophobe, you're a hater, you're a conspiracy theorist, blah, blah, blah. That is supposed to simply end the debate. And in the minds of many people who have been well programmed, it does. Because they've been trained that, oh, this is woo territory and we don't want to go there. They don't go where the evidence leads. They simply go, oh, we don't want to go there because that is not the collective consensus today. And that's how it is. Break it up. And then you don't see where we're going. Look at the European Union. How did the European Union get to where it's going? Started out as a coal treaty. Remember that? A treaty over the distribution of coal throughout Europe. Then it became a European common market. Then it became the European Union. Finally, the next stage will be the United States of Europe. We'll talk a lot more about that next week on how this whole globalist thing is being arranged. The Brexit vote coming up in June. And the protest, have you seen the fines they want to levy, that the European Commission wants to levy upon member states like Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and I think there are a couple of others? We were talking about $290,000 per person rejected. I mean, this is really ham-handed stuff. Why does that seem so bizarre? Why do bakers in Oregon get fined $130,000 for failing to bake a wedding cake? Maybe that's a $5,000 or $10,000 offense. $130,000? You can always tell when you've hit the mother lode of an agenda by stabbing it. I don't mean physically walking up and stabbing a person. Don't misunderstand me. By jamming your poking rod into that agenda and threatening it, financially or functionally. Soon as you do that, it's like jabbing a stick into an ant nest on a hot summer day. I think of these up in the Pacific Northwest. We have these ants that have red heads and black abdomens. They're great to put into an ant farm because they're incredible workers, better than the California red ants. But you stick a stick in their big hive. They're made out of pine needles and big domes. But on a hot day, oh my gosh, they go nuts. They come out to defend the hive. Any other time, they sit there and smile at you and, oh yes, well, you're a little misinformed. No, you're a conspiracy theorist. You're a hater. They don't get too upset. But the moment you prick it to the point that it's a threat, that's when everybody comes out. Look at everybody who's coming out on the Brexit vote. The International Monetary Fund, the European Commission, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings Institute, Peterson Institute for International Economics, and a lot of the corporatist mainstream media are literally in a frenzy to try to scare voters away from having Great Britain secede from the European Union. Even President Obama broke tradition, goes over and starts threatening the Brits about what's going to happen to them if they dare vote to secede from the Union. Why are they all upset? Okay, well, to get into this new global order that they've always been talking about, sometimes it's called global governance, sometimes it's called the New World Order, sometimes it's just called the New Order. You know, there are different terms for it. The terms are changed to protect the guilty. And in order to do that, they realized that they would have to do, as Richard Gardner said, that they would have to do end runs around national sovereignty. And they would have to do it step by step, end running national sovereignty, so nobody would catch on. And one of the big steps was the creating of regional governance areas. And the European Union was one of those great big experiments. Now, when they started out back in the 1950s and moved into the common market in Europe, the elitist founders, go back and read their stuff, knew where they were going. But when confronted with it directly, and this is the little game that goes on, they write about it, they give speeches about it, but when confronted with it to the point that it would jeopardize them, they backpedal and deny it or attack the people who are attacking them. John Birch Society, to their credit, has gotten a lot of this stuff right. I'm not a John Bircher, by the way. But the Birch Society has gotten a lot of this right. And it wasn't until they were having an impact that David Rockefeller began attacking the John Birch Society. Why? Because they were putting light on what was going on in terms of this globalist. And that's when the Rockefellers began to attack the John Birch Society publicly because they were exposing too much of what was going on, and they were well documented in what they were saying about this new path that we're at. As I said, once you get close, when you start having a public influence, boom, that's when you get the reaction. And that's also a way of testing as to whether or not you're really in the mother lode, the main vein of what's going on. As soon as you get a reaction, you know something. Other than that, they don't care. Same thing in education. Educrats have had this long-running agenda. There's hundreds of pages of material by educrats about how we needed to transform society, how we need global government, how we need to take the children away from the parents, the ideas of the parents, how we need to create a new global consciousness rather than national consciousness, how we need to change history to do it. It's all there. And if we have some time, probably not today, maybe I should just start reading some of this stuff on a regular basis so you understand that was the agenda that moved through. That's an agenda. And what they did is find like-minded people and raise up new generations of people who have the same like mind. It's very much a process of evangelization. It's like a religion. But trying to create this new world order, as President Bush described it back in the early part of his presidency, and he thought it was marvelous that when we dealt with Saddam Hussein back then, we were a coalition of the world groupings was going into a country, violating sovereignty and telling them what to do. So anyway, this regionalism was very, very important. That was what NAFTA was all about, this try to squash Canada, the U.S., and Mexico into a region, to drop the borders, to increase the migration of peoples across the borders. And the European Union was a major example of that. They took all of these countries and squished them all together, and now that's threatening to break up, which threatens the long-term objectives, and that's why they're in a frenzy over it. That's how you identify it, and that's why you're seeing what you're seeing. So if we zoom out and say, well, what was the whole plan of this crowd, this new order that they kept talking about? There were several different streams. The first early on streams were the Cecil Rhodes and the Rhodes Scholarships. He believed in an Anglo-American dominated world order. The Fabian Society as well was another one of these organizations dedicated to bringing about this new global hegemony of the English-speaking peoples, where we would basically control the world and organize the system for the lesser intelligent nations. Very shortly after the League of Nations fell apart, one of the luminaries behind the League of Nations, Colonel Edward Mandell House, the shadow person behind President Woodrow Wilson, they started the Council on Foreign Relations at a meeting at a hotel in Paris in 1921. The first effort at making a global government had failed. It was rejected by the U.S. Senate, and as a result of that, we never joined it. And so the next run was going to be the United Nations, and the CFR's purpose was to form a global government. That's ultimately it. So that was one of the flows. You had the Rhodes Scholarships, the Fabian Society, Council on Foreign Relations. I think it was the Royal Institute for International Affairs. It was the counterpart to the CFR here in this country. Then you had another stream come up from Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the occultist of the 1800s. And her successor, there was one in between them, Annie Besant, but her main successor was Alice A. Bailey. Alice A. Bailey channeled by her own acknowledgement from, she called it an ascended master, we would call it a demon spirit, the plan. And it involved global government, education, to take over and transformation of education. There was nothing left out in this plan. Now, she passed away in the late 1940s. However, the organization that came out of all of this, of the Theosophical Society and their later descendants, were originally the Lucifer Publishing Company. That was later changed to Lucis Trust. And Lucis Trust today remains a major non-governmental organization at the United Nations in New York. You can still get Alice A. Bailey's little booklets on her plan, the demonically inspired plan for creating a new world order, global government. So that's the second flow. So there's a spiritual flow. The third flow came out of the New Age movement, and that flow was moving towards an age of Aquarius. That's where Marilyn Ferguson got her book, The Aquarian Conspiracy. And at one point, you could have chalked all these people off as religious kooks, but in reality, you have a lot of heavy hitters who really believe this and believe very much in what's going on in the secularist global organizations, and there's a lot of flow back and forth between all of them. And so that's why you have this coordinated attack right now on what's going on the Brexit. Does it mean everybody in these organizations understands that? No. There's different levels of people who understand. Ultimately, the plan for a new order would be redistribution. This is sort of a summary here. The redistribution of human and financial resources through migration, a global economy, and a global welfare system. The elites have wanted a uniform worldwide education system that would standardize both social learning and work skills everywhere. It would have to, number one, do away with U.S. history. That was one of the things they said early on, which the educrat elites who were in the middle of this said we have got to get rid of. We have got to change the history because people cannot have a sense of nationalism. We need to get them to think globally rather than locally. And isn't that what Secretary of State Kerry just said? They're all trying to get us to have this global consciousness together. Control of the mainstream media and other propaganda channels. This was really important. As a matter of fact, Professor Carroll Quigley in Tragedy and Hope, it's a big book. I've got a copy on my reference shelf here. It's 1,100 pages. But he wrote about what he called these roundtable groups. And you have to remember, he was President Bill Clinton's mentor at Georgetown University. Clinton has mentioned him several times when he was in public office. But from his book, he said, this myth, like all fables, does in fact have a modicum of truth. There does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the communists act. Stop there. He was referring to the John Birch Society in particular there. Okay, pick up the quote. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the roundtable groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups and frequently does so. I know of the operation of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. That, to me, is one of the most succinct quotes from Tragedy and Hope, because for everybody who jumps up and down and yells conspiracy theory, this guy was a professor at Georgetown University. Bill Clinton's mentor wrote this very big book on the history of the 20th century, Tragedy and Hope, and how the underlying levels of reality operate in politics. Now, as far as media, here's what he said. He said, there grew up in the 20th century a power structure between London and New York, which penetrated deeply into university life, the press, and the practice of foreign policy. The American branch of this English establishment exerted much of its influence through 5 American newspapers. Here they are: New York Times, Herald Tribune, Christian Science Monitor, Washington Post. I don't have the 5th one here. Why didn't he list that? That's interesting. I wonder if it's a Chicago thing. Okay. Well, anyway, I won't worry about that right now. But that shows you where it's going. Let's go back to what it was John Foster Dulles said again. This was his proposal for global government back in 1942. Okay, a world government of delegated powers. There you have the United Nations. You have the structure for it. Number 2, immediate limitations on national sovereignty. That's where that battle is. It's going on right now to try to force us into international agreements, climate change treaties, you name the treaty, in the name of another panic or something else we have to deal with. Get us into a treaty where we yield some of our sovereignty, and thereby we're blurring the lines between national sovereignty and the right to make laws for our country versus what the global commons, the global collective, can make. Endemic to this is the need to suppress the ability of independent states in the United States to dissent from what is going on. Why all these fights over bathrooms between North Carolina and the federal government, between Mississippi and the rights on one side? And we see all of this nonsense going on, this tension between states. And unfortunately, most of our state officials now don't have the chutzpah to do what states really should do in order to preserve that balance, which is there. That balance is being eroded and dissolved. Okay, next one, international control of all armies and navies. And there was a publication put out by our own State Department called Freedom from War, way back during the Kennedy administration, in which it admitted, it said very publicly that the goal is to achieve a merger of the Russian and the American militaries under the United Nations. That was the ultimate goal. That was pretty brazen for them to put out, but that was a State Department document that came out in the 1960s. All right, so that one is, we're still a ways off on that one. That one doesn't seem to be working too well. But limitations on national sovereignty, that's what international treaties and regional alliances is all about. A world government of delegated powers. Well, we sort of have it, but it's not working too well. Nevertheless, we're being dragged in that direction. However, a universal system of money. That's what the powers that be, all the little secret meetings going on, that's what the powers that be are really negotiating on right now, is when the dollar dies, what is the new system going to look like? And B, we have to get rid of cash. We have to prevent people from dissenting, and we have to force them into going along with whatever it is we want. We have to know what they're doing, and to do that, we have to get rid of cash. Number 1, 2, 3,